Yeah, awesome. Okay, you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
All right, give me just a second to get going
Yeah,
here.
yeah, no rush.
I'm so
Um,
used to presenting on Teams and Google that Zoom is something new to me. I can't believe I made it through the pandemic without using Zoom. So just bear with me for a second.
yeah, it looks perfect. Everything seems to be working
Okay,
great.
all right, so
Perfect.
here we are. So I'm going to be continuing the conversation around work permit applications, but specifically, I'm going to be focusing on CPTPP. And what you're going to be learning today is, first of all, what is CPTPP, which are the eligible countries, the qualifications that are required to apply for this type of work permit, and what are the requirements in terms of language and wage, what the application process looks like for you and for your employer, and also common mistakes that can happen when submitting an application. All right, so um, first I wanted to take a couple minutes to introduce myself. My full name is Mitzi Marait Medrano. I'm a registered Canadian immigration consultant, and I'm also authorized to represent clients in front of the Immigration and Refugee Board. And I came to Canada around 18 years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago as an international student. And after a couple of years, I decided to continue my post-secondary education at Simon Fraser University. I graduated with a business major, and eventually I decided to make a career change and go back to school to Queen's University and study immigration law. And here we are today. So the reason why I'm mentioning my background today, it's because I wanted to share with you that there's no linear path to your immigration journey. You're likely going to go through a lot of up and downs, and you're going to have to adjust your strategy depending on when you came to Canada or if you're still in your home country. Immigration laws change all the time, and you need to be able to build that ability to be resilient and to adjust to changes. So I promise you that even though I came a while ago, it wasn't easy and it wasn't linear. So I know that a lot of you are already in Canada and that are looking for ways to stay. So really my focus today is to give you more information so that you can make an informed decision about what your next steps are going to look like. And even if this does not apply specifically to your situation, it's always good for you to know this information so that you can start thinking about, okay, so if I don't qualify for this specific type of work permit, what are the other options out there? Because in reality, there's so many options depending on your background and your country of citizenship. There's most likely going to be a path for you that you can follow and continue your immigration journey. All right, so before I dive into the content of today's presentation, I just wanted to make sure that you know that this presentation is for general information purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice. The reason being is that every case is going to be unique and different. You are a unique individual with a unique background, and what applied to one person will not apply to the next. So what applied to me will likely not apply to you, and saying what applied to your friend will likely not be the same case for someone else you know. So always please consult with a regulated Canadian immigration consultant or immigration lawyer before taking any steps, and read the documentation available on the government website. I know there is a lot of information out there. YouTube, TikTok, a lot of professionals will make our best effort to be present in social media and provide you with verified information, but there's also a lot of noise out there, and you have to be careful with the kind of information you consume at the end of the day. And that's why we always recommend to consult before you take any steps. Something else that I wanted to mention is that immigration rules and IRCC policies change frequently. We have seen a lot of change over the last couple of years. So it's always good to verify the current requirements before you submit an application. The information I'm presenting today is valid as of today. Nothing has changed. but some changes might come along the way. For example, Anna was talking about CUSMA earlier, and we know there's likely going to be changes in CUSMA later down the road. So if that is one of the trade agreements that you will consider to apply for a work permit, just make sure that when you apply, all the information is current and up to date. Same applies for what you are going to be learning here with me. Before you submit an application, make sure that the information is current. And lastly, being here today is really great, but this is the first step. This will not replace any personalized professional advice. As I mentioned earlier, likely your immigration journey is very unique. If you are in Canada, you could be here as a student, worker, visitor, or under any other status. And this might not necessarily apply to you, so it's always good to consider your full immigration history before taking any decision. All right, so I'm going to dive into the content of today's presentation now. So first, I wanted to start by explaining what is CPTPP. So this is a comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are some countries that participate in this trade agreement, but there are some key advantages to this. The first one being that there's no LMIA required, and there's an exemption code for this, which is T52, which means that the work permit application will be processed differently. In terms of how it is processed, your employer will be required to use the employer portal to submit a job offer, and this is going to be processed under the International Mobility Program, which means that there's no LMIA required. So because this application is processed under the International Mobility Program and not the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, you're going to get a benefit out of this because the processing time is going to be so much shorter. So the employers typically who apply to hire foreign nationals under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, they need to submit what's called an LMIA. And oftentimes, the processing time alone for an LMIA can be an average of 13 weeks, give or take, depending on the type of LMIA, which of course adds to the overall processing time of the work permit application. And most importantly, under LMIA required work permits, they need to prove that there is no Canadian or PR that can do the job. So this requirement is removed when you apply for a work permit under this free trade agreement, which is really great because the process is not as intense for the employer. It's a little bit easier in the sense that they just need to submit the job offer. They still need to be compliant and prove that the job offer is genuine, but you're going to benefit from that shorter processing time. Something else that I wanted to clarify here is that in order to apply for a work permit under CPTPP, you must have a prearranged job offer. What this means is that you must have already an offer of employment from a Canadian employer before you enter Canada. There's few exceptions where a person who's already in Canada can benefit from this type of application. But generally speaking, one of the requirements is that you apply for this work permit before you travel to Canada. You cannot enter Canada to look for work under this program. All right, so first I wanted to cover which countries are covered under this free trade agreement. So this free trade agreement, it's mostly going to benefit citizens of Australia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Japan, Malaysia, and Brunei. And one key distinction here is that this free trade agreement is going to cover professional occupations, which means those occupations under Tier 0 and 1, and some technician occupations under Tier 2 and 3. Each country has different occupation lists that are covered under this free trade agreement. But generally speaking, for professional occupations, for citizens and PRs, permanent residents of Australia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, all tier 0 and 1 occupations are going to be eligible with some exceptions. And those exceptions are going to include those occupations in health, education, social services, cultural industries, recreation, fitness, postal, telecom management, judges, and notaries. With Japan, the same rule applies. The only difference is that university researchers are also added to the list of exceptions. And for Malaysia, there's only a short positive list of occupations that do qualify for this kind of work permit. So before applying, the most important thing is to make sure that the job offer, what you're going to be doing in Canada, qualifies under the list that it's published for each individual country. In the case of Renee, only petroleum engineers are going to be qualifying under the professional occupations. Now, for technicians, it is a little bit different. For each country, there's going to be a specific eligible occupations and are limited to specific positive lists that are published for each country. And it's always good to verify before applying that your occupation is actually covered on the country schedule. One key distinction here is that only citizens of Australia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Japan could apply under technician occupations, which are tier 2 and 3. And as I said earlier, because there's a restrictive list for each country, it's always best to check which occupations apply. Now, this free trade agreement offers another really great advantage, which is that your spouse can also qualify for an open work permit, no matter if you're applying under professional or technician occupations. And this is really great because of recent changes of regulations that now open work permits for spouses are restricted to certain occupations. In this case, if you are applying under this free trade agreement, generally speaking, your spouse will qualify for this type of work permit. And it's going to be issued for 1 year initially. But the caveat here is that you need to be a citizen of Australia, Chile, Japan, or Mexico, or a permanent resident of Australia. So those are the only countries that will qualify your spouse for your spouse, to get a work permit when you apply under this free trade agreement. All right, so moving on. What are the requirements that you need to make sure you have before you apply? So requirements are going to be a little bit different compared to other free trade agreements. For professionals, meaning occupations in tier 0 and 1, you're going to be required to prove that you have at least a 4-year post-secondary degree, with the exception of Australia, where 3-year bachelor degrees are accepted. You're also required to have at least 2 years paid work experience in the sector of the job being offered in Canada. So, for example, if you have a degree in graphic design and you're applying as a graphic designer, and back home your experience is only as admin assistant, that's not going to count towards experience in the sector of the job being offered in Canada. However, if you are being offered a position again as a graphic designer, but your experience back home is working for a large advertising agency doing graphic design for social media, that experience will qualify you. So you just have to make sure that your previous work experience is in the same industry as the job you're applying in Canada. Now, there are some professional occupations that require provincial licensing. Engineers is a good example. Architects is another good example. So if that is a requirement under the NOC, you have to make sure that you also have the required licensing in the province that you're going to be working on. So that's one of the requirements as well for you to be able to apply for this type of work permit. And the last point here is that you need to prove that you're able to communicate in either English or French. So similar to COSMA, where you have to prove that you are proficient in English or French, this is also going to be a requirement here. They don't ask you for language tests, but later on, I'm going to tell you how you can make sure you fulfill these requirements. Now, for technicians, the requirements are going to be a little bit different. They are required to prove that they have at least a 2-year post-secondary degree, which in some countries could also be called a technical degree. And again, that's the minimum entry requirement. Another key distinction here is that instead of 2 years work experience, you're required to have 4 years paid work experience. Again, it needs to be in the sector of the job that you're going to be doing in Canada. So the work experience required is a double of that of professionals. So for example, if you do have a degree, a technical degree in construction, and you're applying for a job as a heavy equipment operator, and you already have, let's say, 2 years work experience in your home country and 2 years work experience in Canada, that will add up to the 4 years paid work experience in the sector of the job you're looking to enter in Canada. But if you have an offer of employment for the same role, again, heavy construction and equipment operator, and your previous work experience was in something completely different outside of the construction industry, then that work experience will not count towards the requirement. So always you need to make sure that that work experience is in the same field that the job you're applying in Canada. Some of these technician occupations might have additional requirements that are defined on the NOC, so you have to make sure that you read the specific requirements for the job that you're being offered, and also you have to make sure that you do have what is required to do the job. Some cases there might be specific certifications, there might be a red seal requirement for your trade, or there might be specific tickets that you need to get in order to be able to fulfill the requirements of the NOC. So you always have to make sure that whatever is required, you also have it. And again, language proficiency, it's also going to be a requirement for technicians. So same rule applies. You have to make sure that you're able to communicate in either English or French. All right, so how do you fulfill language requirements? So even though officers are not explicitly going to ask you for CELPIP or IELTS, you're still required to provide evidence. So the kind of evidence you can include here will be proof that you previously studied in Canada, for example, and that your education was in English or French, or if you have prior work experience in an English or French-speaking country, that could also serve you as acceptable evidence to prove that you can communicate in the language that is required. Additionally, if you had worked for a Canadian employer, they can write you a letter mentioning that you were proficient in the language and that you were able to communicate in the work environment. Or if you are maybe extending a permit and you had already worked for this same employer. So the employer can write you a letter and say that you were able to do the job and communicate. Now, I wanted to touch on a very important requirement, and this is something that differentiates this trade agreement from others, because the offer of employment that you are required to have has a very strict wage requirement. So in terms of wage, the officer is going to look at what's called the prevailing wage. And this can be a little bit tricky to understand. So whenever you have doubts about this, please consult with a professional so we can walk your employers through how to define what the wage needs to be for the offer of employment. But in terms of what the prevailing wage is, it's going to be the highest of the median job bank wage for your specific occupation in the location you're going to be doing the job, or the employer's internal wage range for the same role, skills, and experience. So whatever is the highest of the two will be considered the prevailing wage, and that's going to be the minimum wage that needs to be offered and on the offer of employment. Something to keep in mind is that additional benefits such as commissions, housing, travel expenses extended healthcare or vacation, those benefits do not count towards the wage requirement. So the job offer needs to explicitly list all the benefits that you're going to be getting, but just remember that that will not count towards the prevailing wage. In terms of the assessment that the officer is going to be doing here, it's very similar to that of an LMIA, wage compliance review. So often when we look at the most common reasons for refusal, it's because the wage requirements are not fulfilled. So again, this is not a very simple application in terms of the employer requirements. So whenever you have doubts about this, or your employer has any questions, please consult with a professional so that you make sure that the wage is the right one for your offer of employment. All right, moving on. Where do you need to apply for this type of work permit? How long is the work permit going to be? Generally speaking, you're going to have to apply outside of Canada at the visa office or your home country. So you apply online before you travel. And this is going to be a requirement for all visa required nationals. So Anna earlier on, I gave the example of a Mexican national. They're not able to apply at port of entry. So the requirement for Mexican nationals, for example, will be to apply at the visa office in Mexico. This is also recommended for first-time applications or for complex applications. So if your employer hasn't done any of these work permit applications before, we recommend that the application is submitted at the visa office outside of Canada. For some foreign nationals, we do have the option to apply at port of entry, but it's only available if the applicant is visa exempt. So you apply directly at the border or the airport, and you must have your complete documentation package. Something to mention is that these kind of applications are complex to some extent in terms of the amount of documentation that is required. So applying at the port of entry always carries a little bit of a risk that the officer might not be as thorough at reviewing your application and that you will be denied entry into Canada. So make sure that if you're applying at the port of entry, you have a bulletproof application package that it's been reviewed very thoroughly to minimize your chance of refusal. And lastly, some people can apply within Canada. So if you're eligible under Regulation 199, so for example, if you currently hold another work permit, study permit, or a temporary resident permit, you might be able to apply within Canada. But you have to apply before your status expires. And I can't highlight this enough. I have to stress this. It needs to be before the status expires. Otherwise, if you're out of status or if you've been out of status, this will not apply to you. You cannot apply within Canada. When you do qualify, you will be under maintained status while the application is being processed. And in the case of extensions for these type of work permits, those ones can also be done within Canada, but it's always going to be at the officer's discretion of whether or not an extension is approved. Something that differentiates this free trade agreement from other trade agreements is that the work permit is initially issued for only 1 year. And there's a possibility for extensions depending on the specific country. And there's some guidelines that we need to follow to make sure that these extensions are granted. But this is a key differentiation. So in terms of validity of your passport, you need to make sure that your passport is valid for at least 1 year before you apply, because your initial work permit is going to be issued for 1 year. All right, so who can benefit from this type of work permit? If you're already in Canada, you might be eligible for a work permit under CPTPP. If you're a student near graduation and not eligible for a postgraduate work permit, provided that you fulfill the requirements for education and work experience. So let's say you already had a degree from your home country and you are a Chilean citizen already with a 4-year degree and you came to Canada to study something else. and you're nearing graduation and you had experience on one of the qualifying NOCs, you might benefit from this type of work permit. Similarly, if you're a PGWP holder and your work permit is near to expire and you're looking for ways to extend your stay in Canada, your employer might support your application under this program without the need for an LMIA. And again, as Anna mentioned earlier in her presentation, you have to make sure that you plan ahead of time and that you submit an application ahead of time. Also, temporary foreign worker can benefit from these programs. So if you're currently working with an LMIA, with a different employer, and you find a new employer that's willing to hire you for a different job, but a job that qualifies under CPTPP and you're a citizen of the qualifying countries, you might also benefit from this. It has a faster processing time compared to applying for a second LMIA. And lastly, if you are a spouse of someone who already holds this type of work permit and you're looking to obtain an open work permit, you can also qualify. All right, so what the application process looks like. So first of all, you need to confirm your eligibility, make sure that you're a citizen of the countries that I mentioned before. You need to double check your occupation qualifies, the education as well, and that you have the experience that is required, either 4 years for professionals or 2 years for technicians. Second step is securing that job offer. So you have to have that signed job offer of employment from a Canadian employer, and you need this before applying. You cannot apply without the signed job offer of employment. The next step will be for your employer to submit the online offer on the employer portal. They need to pay for a compliance fee, which is $230. And they need to use the right LMIA exemption code, which is T52. This is one of the most common mistakes here, and the step where most employers need assistance from an RCIC or a lawyer, because this can be a little bit tricky if they haven't done this before. The next step for you will be to gather all your documentation, collect your diplomas, transcript, proof of previous work experience, make sure your passport is valid, and gather all the evidence that is required for you to apply. And then the last step will be to submit the actual work permit application. This could be done, as I said before, either online at the visa office in your home country or at port of entry if you are eligible to apply at port of entry. So how does IRCC is going to evaluate your application? The first thing they're going to look at is the genuineness of the offer of employment. So they are going to verify that your employer is actually engaged in business. So they have a physical office and they're in operations. And there's many ways how they can prove that. There's some documentation that is recommended that's attached to the application to prove that. And more importantly, the offer of employment needs to be consistent with the needs of the employer. So for example, if a restaurant is going to hire you to be, again, a heavy equipment operator, they might question the need for that role. So the offer of employment needs to be aligned with the actual needs of the employer. And they also need to prove that they're able to fulfill the terms of the offer of employment in terms of wages, hours, and working conditions. There's some documentation that is required to prove that. And this is more important if this is the first time the employer is applying for a work permit of this type. The second thing that IRCC is going to look at is whether or not you have the qualifications to do the job. So education requirements, if you have any licensing, provincial territorial licensing, if required for your job, if you already have the relevant work experience that is required, and of course, your ability to communicate in either English or French. And the last thing that's going to be reviewed are the ties to your home country. So this will apply to both, whether you are applying outside of Canada or in Canada. The officer will always need to be satisfied that you will leave at the end of your work authorization period. Some of the aspects that they look at is whether or not you have property outside of Canada, family, if you can continue working in your home country, and of course, if you've been for a long time in Canada, or you also are planning to apply eventually for PR, and there is something that we call dual intent. This needs to be addressed in your application and your submission letter, just to make sure there's no doubts on the officer side about you leaving the country at the end of the authorized work period. All right, so I will quickly cover the most common mistakes and the reasons why this type of permits can be refused. The most common one is assuming this is path for you and you are not a citizen of the countries that are included here. So just make sure that you're a citizen of the countries that I mentioned before, or a permanent resident of Australia before you submit an application. A lot of people also get confused with the experience that is required for the position that's being offered by the employer. Just remember that it's 4 years for technicians, 2 years for professionals. On the employer side, submitting an incomplete offer of employment is often one of the most common mistakes when they're filling out the required information on the portal. They need to make sure that they're specifying the NOC, the duties, salary, hours you're going to be working on. So everything needs to match on the offer of employment. And some piece of advice that I want to give you here is to never copy and paste the NOC specifically. Please ask this to your HR person or whoever's in charge of issuing offers of employment in your company to make sure that they're writing a proper offer of employment and to not copy paste what's on the NOC, because this can be a huge red flag for the officer reviewing your application. As I mentioned earlier, making mistakes on the employer portal, this is the part where many employers require professionals to come in and help them, because these type of applications are not routine for a lot of small and medium businesses. So always making sure that all information is filled out correctly. Some people also made the mistake to walk into port of entry and expect the work permit to be issued at the airport. But as I said earlier, this is only available to foreign nationals that are not required to have a visa to come to Canada. And the last mistake that I commonly see here is for spousal work permits. So a lot of spouses apply for a work permit, for an open work permit until under C41, but one of their key requirements under C41 is that their work permit needs to have at least 16 months left on the applicant side, on the principal applicant side, sorry, on the spouses. But this is not the right code to apply for a spousal work permit under CPTPP. You need to use T53 instead, because that requirement needs waived. All right, so that covers everything today. I know that I had given you a lot of information, and I don't expect you to remember all or to fully understand this, because these kind of applications can be a little bit complex. But I just want to make sure that you know that I'm available to you for any further questions. You can scan the code that's here, and you will have the opportunity to book with me for a 15-minute introductory call if you desire to have, like any clarification about what I touched on today, or if you have any other further questions regarding other free trade agreements, because I know it's a very short list of countries and therefore a short list of people that will qualify for this type of work permit. But just know that there are many other free trade agreements that you can likely benefit from. So if you have any questions about that or other immigration topics, feel free to scan the code and book a call with me so I can just answer your questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Mara. It was so great. Definitely very, very packed. Like this session and the previous Anna session, it's just so much to know about it. But also, I just love that people now can realize that there are these opportunities on the table that truly a lot of people don't know about. They just don't know about these opportunities. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
That
thank
was
you.
great. So let's see if